Arabia. So bringing these issues up again so soon may be provocative. However, it also seems like the international players have largely accepted the Russian vision of what's going to happen in Syria, and so perhaps we'll at least see a continued de-escalation, but like I said, no actual settlement or end to the war.
Let me change the question a little bit for you, Michael. Janine mentioned that sometimes we're not talking to the right people. How do we think about irreconcilables in a reconciliation process? How do we determine who the right people are to speak with? In the Syria context, we have al-Nusra, which is outside the normal mental construct of kind of a two-dimensional fight. These are multi-dimensional, where the enemy of our enemy is not necessarily our friend. In Afghanistan, the Haqqanis are part of the Taliban, but they've been designated a foreign terrorist organization. So how do we think about who to talk to and who's reconcilable and irreconcilable?
Big challenges, and I'd have thought that the more degrees of freedom that we can provide to the people who are tasked with the diplomatic work, the better. In other words, it really sounds like a recipe for disaster to take somebody like Stefan de Mistura and charge them, okay, here are the ones you can talk to, here are the ones you can't talk to, please get the solution. Because if you want to stop the fighting, ultimately you have to get a critical mass of the fighters have got to be on board with your settlement. Otherwise, it's going to be fictitious. It's going to be like, we've had several of those settlements previously in Afghanistan. I mean, they're signed and they're never implemented, or they fall apart quickly. I actually hear it from some of the Taliban who I've had the privilege to talk to, almost turned upside down. That it's well known in sort of political practice that quite often movements use the process of negotiations of trying to boost their cohesiveness. The greatest sort of proponent of this, or at least the practicer of this, who I'm aware with, was Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who in the negotiations which ultimately led to partition of British India and the founding of Pakistan, he set himself up as told the sole spokesman. You're going to talk with Muslims, you're going to talk with me. Nobody else has a right to represent him, and he managed to leverage the run-up to partition to consolidate his hold, build the Muslim League, and ultimately make Pakistan a reality. And when you find a situation like Afghanistan, where we're in that. The current leadership of the Taliban, no, they're going for military victory. They see a relatively weak and dysfunctional government, which is what's left of what we hoped for of the Afghan liberal order. They are prepared to wait and fight them out, and they have emerged as the sole interlocutor for all our engagement over the past few years. I mean, even from the times of your own previous incarnation, and a lot of the people in the movement who have reached different conclusions from those who are holding on to the leadership, who believe that a perpetual conflict doesn't actually count as a victory for us. We can do better than that. They of course they're frozen out when your engagement is essentially with a single address. So I think that it's important to look for creative approaches in the engagement where you work out, okay, we know that we have to carry with us, the main body of fighters, but we also don't want to freeze out of the political process. We have to look for creative ways of bringing them in. Those who might be part of a process of change in the way that the fighting organization does business. Creative thought there. And then there's a different part of the dilemma, which is around, which is the Afghan equivalent of the Syrian problem of those who are never going to sign up to any kind of deal. And for the sake of argument, in Afghanistan, we've got the Al Qaedas, we've got the Daeshes. Rest assured, there is a list of those who see the continuation of conflict as a political opportunity because they're like, I mean, what used to be the Trotskyites in my days at university, who always had to have a protest about something so that you could organize and mobilize and build your ranks. So these people are not going to be about part of some kind of consensus solution. And of course one has to understand them, and probably one has to seek one needs the discrete interaction with other parts of, again, the armed people on that side, where they have moved from a position of being in alliance with the irreconcilables to deciding that their future best interest may actually be disassociated from them, helping to marginalize them, and being part of an emerging pro-peace coalition. So we've got to yes, we've got to deal with the hardliners in power. We've got to deal with the sort of the peaceniks who aren't in power but can still be useful, and we've got to understand but ultimately marginalize the irreconcilables.
Before I'd like to give the audience a chance, and while the microphones are getting ready, and going back to where we started, this question of how we see the conflict. I mean, when you look at this group, the one thing that strikes you, it certainly struck me, is the level of expertise you have, not just overall, but in the field, on the ground. These are people who watch the conflicts, see the conflicts firsthand, don't just read about them in capital. So how much of a gulf do you see between how we see these conflicts from capitals through the media versus what you see kind of firsthand on the ground? How wide is that gulf, and how big of a problem is that? Janine?
Well, I can address it, but I also want to ask Michael something. Do you feel we could get historical lessons from the Good Friday Agreement? Because, as we know, John Major had said, it turns my stomach to think that we will ever speak to killers and murderers. And in terms of, and as we know, Jonathan Powell and others, Tony Blair, then went on and did talk to the IRA and make agreements with them. And historically, there's always been this repugnance about we can never speak to terrorists, we can't speak to killers. Governments, if people are held hostage, I'm French and American by nationality, I always carry my French passport because I know the French will pay for me if I'm kidnapped, whereas the Americans or the Brits will not. So how do you draw the line? I mean, at some point, and I've been researching this, people do talk to Nusra, and ISIS perhaps might not be ripe yet. It might not be, the ripeness isn't there, the moment to negotiate, or at least talk. But what about just opening up dialogue? And do you think we can learn from what happened in Stormont in those days, and how it did eventually lead to the Good Friday Agreement, which, as you know, I grew up in England in those times before, and there was it was like living in, people felt that it was a terrorist war.
I'm almost inclined to ask Jeff, what did you conclude?
Well, yeah.
I mean, do we talk to terrorists, as Jonathan Powell would put it? Terrorists who are designated by the State Department or the UN list. But these are the people, these are the very people we need to open dialogue with. So how do we get around that?
Well, I mean, Secretary Clinton, obviously, when she announced the U.S. policy on reconciliation with the Taliban, tried to soften the blow by saying, well, you have to understand, in conflict, you don't come to the table with your friends, you come to the table with your enemies. But in these multidimensional conflicts, it clearly is not so simple, right? But let's, if you want to offer thoughts on the kind of the ground perspective versus the media perspective as in terms of how we see the conflict, and then let's go to the audience and get some questions. Nir?
I used to be a journalist before I began this mediation thing. So I worked in Iraq, Afghanistan, elsewhere, and I've never seen a conflict so poorly reported, and the reality on the ground.
Which conflict, Nir?
The Syrian conflict, okay. Rather. I mean, Iraq was very terribly reported. There are issues of the embedded reporters and of lack of access and lack of Arabic experts, or that lack of area experts in general. But in Syria, even more so, because Syria was kind of almost a black hole in terms of media and academia before the crisis began. And then there was lack of access issues because the government was issuing visas or because it was too dangerous for most people. And because of the Arab Spring euphoria, where there was a sense that there's good guys and bad guys, and this beautiful, amazing thing is happening, it's the best thing that ever happened, and freedom is going to ring throughout the Arab world. And so the complex narrative of Syria certainly never emerged, and it was immediately a good versus evil, and also a simplistic sectarian narrative where it's an Alawite dictator oppressing a Sunni majority population, which isn't true in Syria, and we'd also simplified the sectarian narrative in Iraq. So it's obviously affected policy because most policy is based on information coming from open source, as is most intelligence, and people have no idea what's going on in Syria with the nature of the insurgency, the nature of the militias affiliated with the regime's intentions, and that's just even when it comes to the Russians. We've had to go back to our Cold War experts on the Soviet Union to try to understand the Russians, and so we've demonized them, and everything they do must be bad because it's the Russians doing it, even if we happen to actually, we can't say it, but be allied quite closely with the Russians, and even with the Iranians and Hezbollah in these conflicts. We have to maintain this good guy, bad guy kind of narrative.
Renee, any thoughts before we go to the audience?
No, I mean, I agree with a lot of what Nir said, but just to add to it, if you just, Egypt was always more than Tahrir, a square, but the peephole through which the story was told was so small that, it was focused on a particular part of the country, which wasn't really representative of what was happening in much of the rest of the country. And, it's the same thing across the Middle East, this idea of, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. Good people do bad things and bad people can do good things. And, you have to consider that spectrum. And the world is completely gray. And we have to approach it as such in our reporting and in our writing and in our discourse.
Well, let's open up this incredible group of expertise to the...
I'm going to give thought first.
Okay, go ahead, and then we'll go to the audience. Michael.
Yeah.
I think it was very relevant, the question you're asking about the field knowledge versus what's been thought far away, because in Afghanistan, my understanding of what's happened is that one reason that attempts at intervention, particularly from the US, have been sort of thwarted and they've achieved outcomes different from what people anticipated was because many of the actors on the ground in Afghanistan are absolutely superb at disinformation, at manipulating relationships. And when people talk about, on a strategic level, but when people talk about a proxy war, what they refer to, like evil powers, paying their proxies to do things for them. Whereas my understanding, it always works the other way around. It's very clever, well-informed, astute Afghan actors who are thinking, this is what I want to achieve against such a person. They're more powerful than me. Who can I enlist, unwittingly preferably, to support me in overcoming my local rival? And and that's how they dealt with the Soviets, and that's how they've played their civil wars. That's how they have duped Pakistan, and that's how they're gaming the US. And what they play upon is indeed this asymmetry of information. They're superbly well informed, and we are superbly badly informed.
Yeah, plays into it.
Yeah.
Completely.
Ending wars is a matter of propaganda wars. So let's go to the audience. Please, if you could, state your affiliation, your name, and please use the microphones.
Pete Apps, I'm Global Affairs columnist at Reuters. I mean, who in government should own this? Because I'm really struck by the fact people like Janine really know how these wars work, but there's no counterpart in Whitehall or Washington. I mean, maybe Michael